Good morning, class. Today's word is Anthropodermic Bibliopegy, or binding books with human skin. Recently, it was discovered that a book lurking in the bowels of Houghton Library at Harvard University was actually bound in human skin. The book in question, Destinies of the Soul, was bound in the 19th century by a man named Dr. Ludovic Boulan, who used the skin of an unclaimed female patient to create the cover. When the story broke, there was an explosion of interest by the media. Everyone from the BBC to the Boston Globe wanted to cover this story. But this wasn't exactly a revelation. Rather, experts who knew of the book's existence already suspected that it was made of human skin. They just didn't have the proof until now. This discovery, however, has awoken the public's imagination. Everybody wants to know more. And recently, I did an interview for Vice magazine with Simon Davis about this very subject because I've had the privilege of seeing and touching several skin books in the course of my research. And one of the things that we discussed was the primary reasons behind Anthropodermic Bibliopegy in the past. Number one, these books were sometimes created as curios. Now, this might seem odd to us today, but think about all the shows on TV, like Oddities, Pawn Stars, Four Rooms. These shows are built around the premise that the odder the object is, the more valuable it is. And believe it or not, there were people in the 18th and 19th centuries who wanted to own books bound in human skin because they were so extraordinary. And a really good example of this is at the Wellcome Library right here in London. It's a 17th century book on female virginity, bound by none other than Dr. Ludovic Boulan, the same guy who was responsible for binding the book that was found recently at Harvard University. Like Destinies of the Soul, this book was also bound with the skin of an unclaimed female patient who presumably died in his care. I think it's safe to say that the good doctor had quite a fetish about skin books. Number two, sometimes these books were made to memorialize the dead. This may also seem odd to us because we interact with the dead in very different ways than people interacted with the dead in the past. And the idea of taking loved one's skin and binding a book with it seems horrendous. Some people gave consent before they died for their skins to be used for memorialization purposes. One of my favorite stories is from the 19th century. It involves a highwayman named James Allen who went by the alias George Walton. One day, he assaulted a man named John A. Fino on the Massachusetts Turnpike. Fino bravely resisted the robbery, even sustaining a gunshot wound in the process. He later became instrumental in the apprehension of his attacker. Before he died, Allen requested that his skin be used to bind a book about his life, and for this to be presented to Fino as a token of his esteem. I would have loved to have been a fly on that historical wall. Maybe not. Number three, these books were sometimes created to punish a person for committing a heinous crime, and a majority of the books in existence are actually bound with the skins of executed criminals. There's a really good example up at Surgeons Hall in Edinburgh, and this is something I've actually gotten to hold personally. In 1828, William Burke and William Hare murdered 16 people over the course of 10 months. Masquerading as body snatchers, the two murderers sold the fresh corpses onto surgeons in Edinburgh, where they were then dissected in private anatomy schools dotted around the city. Burke and Hare were eventually apprehended when one of their victims was discovered in the dissection room of Dr. Robert Knox, who had been purchasing many of the suspiciously fresh bodies from the two men over the past several months. Hare turned King's evidence and was released, while Burke took the blame and was sentenced to death. What awaited him at the end of that rope was much worse than even he could imagine. After Burke was executed, his body was dissected. This was nothing out of the ordinary. Since the Murder Act of 1752, the law required that all murderers be dissected publicly as an additional punishment. But with Burke, they went a step further. They didn't just bind a book in his skin, they made a pocketbook, or a wallet. Its covers were soft and pliable after all these years, and reminded me that this was indeed used on a regular basis. In faded gold letters, the front read, "Burke's Skin Pocketbook." When I turned it over in my hands, I saw that the words "executed 28th January 1829" completed the story. So that's it, the history of Anthropodermic Bibliopegy. If you're interested in whether human beings can be taxidermied, check out Caitlin Doty over on Ask Mortician, who's talking about this very thing right now. Oh no, Bucket, what have you done? Well, I guess Bucket wants me to address one last question, which is, how exactly was this done in the past? Unfortunately, Tanners didn't leave much behind in written records, except for things like account books. But what I can say is that the books I've held bound in human skin look and feel very much like any normal leather-bound book. So we can assume that the human skin was treated just like any other animal hide. Historically, the skins were thoroughly washed and soaked in water to remove any traces of blood that could discolor the binding. The washed skins were then soaked in a solution, usually consisting of lime, which would loosen hair and fat on the skin. Afterwards, they were then re-washed and treated with tannins to preserve them, and oils to prevent the leather from drying out too quickly. The skins were then hung to dry, usually 7 to 10 days. At this point, the skin could be stretched and softened and used to bind a book. Happy? I guess Bucket wants me to bind this book. Ugh. Well, let's get started. God, this Portobello Road gin is really good. Oh, some of you may be wondering why Alex wasn't in this episode. Or was he?